The New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society is pleased to present this recording from January 18th, 2024, on using editors in the writing process. Content editors, story editors, copy editors. How are they different? What do they do? Why and when should you use them? Stephanie Cowell is in conversation with Susanne Dunlap and Melodie Winawer on how, when, where they used editors during their writing journeys. The video starts about a minute into the program, after Susan Wands introduces Stephanie Cowell. Information about our chapter and its leadership is available at our website, link listed in the description. Thank you and enjoy the program.
Introduce you to our current chair, Stephanie Cowell. Our host tonight, Stephanie Cowell, has been an opera singer, balladeer, founder of the Strawberry Opera and other arts venues, including a Renaissance Festival and an outdoor arts series in New York City. Stephanie is the author of The Boy in the Rain, Nicholas Cook, The Physician of London, The Players, a novel of the young Shakespeare, Marrying Mozart, one of my favorite of hers, and Claude and Camille, a novel of Monet. Her work has been translated into 9 languages and adapted into an opera. Stephanie is the recipient of an American Book Award. All right, everyone, let me introduce you to Stephanie. And Stephanie, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to be there. I love to be in this particular branch of the Historical Novel Society. It's really great. Okay, so now I am going to introduce our 2 panelists. Our program is Editors, when to use the different array of editors in your writing process. So, and we're going to have writers, Melodie Winawer, the author of The Scribe of Siena and Anticipation, which had a starred Publishers Weekly Pick of the Week review. Melodie is a physician, scientist, and associate professor of neurology at Columbia University. She lives with her spouse and their 3 children in Woodstock, Vermont, where she was telling us before it is very, 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 very snowy. And Susanne Dunlap is a very old friend of mine. And I think, Susanne, we met at the Historical Novel Society, one of the conferences we did.
And we did in Albany.
Friends ever since. And she's given me great editorial advice. She's the award-winning author of over a dozen historical novels, as well as an author accelerator certified book coach in both fiction and nonfiction. Her love of history began in academia with a PhD in music history from Yale. Her novel, The Courtesan's Daughter, was published on April 25th. Her novel, The Portraitist, won first prize in its category in the 2022 Eric Hoffer Book Awards. Today, she lives, coaches, and writes in beautiful Biddeford, Maine. And so here we are, and I would like to start off with each of you. Maybe we could start with Melodie, telling us in a few words about your latest published novel, and then, if you might, telling me what sort of editorial help did you have in this? I've only known there to be 2 types of editors, and now I hear there's a lot, and I'm very anxious to hear about it.
Yeah, I had a very different experience with the 2 novels I have out. My most recent book, Anticipation, is a dual timeline novel about Byzantine Greece, also in the present, and it's about the city of Mistras, which is now entirely in ruins, but was the capital of the late Byzantine Empire after the fall of Constantinople, and it is still an intact city that you can walk through. Even though it is almost all gone, there are still 15 churches there and a working monastery, and the buildings are all there. It's like a ghost town of Byzantium. And it inspired me to write a story to bring it back to life, which tells the tale of a modern New York scientist, Helen, who recently bereaved, goes on a trip with her son to Greece and discovers in Mistras a mysterious tour guide who lives on the edge of the city and of time, both figuratively and literally. And he has an interesting role to play in the city's history, as well as being its tour guide. and is pursued through the generations, which gives it away slightly, but not too much, by someone who believes him to be the cure to a curse. Helen is inadvertently drawn into this in her connection to him, and she and her son end up, in part because of what she knows, and in part because of their connection to him, wrapped up in the mystery of his role in the city. So it was a very fun book to write. Editorial wise, very different experience for my second novel, which that was, because it was bought unfinished by my publisher, with 130 pages done and an outline, and I had 18 months to finish it, in contract, while working full time as a physician scientist. I had a promised in-house editor who, the interesting thing is that the imprint that acquired the book and the editor that I had when she said, I want your second novel, show me what you've got, we'll take it, I love it, you can do this, 18 months. Then the imprint closed. My editor moved to another publisher entirely. She was a fantastic supporter and got a great job, and I don't, begrudge her move, but she was no longer my editor. And then the head of the publishing house that had acquired my book also retired. So then I was in this very interesting position of being in contract to write a book without an imprint or an editor. Not to say that we were all, many of us were in this position because it was Touchstone Books that of Simon & Schuster that closed.
Of course.
So all of those people were divided between Gallery and Atria, two other imprints, and I was given a new editor at Gallery. Fortunately, that editor, Kate Dresser, came on before the book had been seen by anyone and before it was finished. So she could have an allegiance to that book from the beginning, rather than, a manuscript that was already accepted that she had never seen before. So I ended up working with her about 3 rounds in that short period of time. I finished on deadline and then rapidly revised it multiple times with her, going into publication as scheduled, which was a very intense experience for someone whose first novel sort of drifted along at my own pace. And actually my editor for that novel, Judy Sternlight, who I hired freelance, who's magnificent and whom I highly recommend, is on the call today, which is very nice for me. So old friends.
So can you that is one of those classic screwed
There's
up.
even more tumult. I haven't because my publication, the publication team actually switched over 3 weeks before it came out also, because I had a marketing, this is Simon & Schuster, right? Everything's very big and you've got all these people. So I had marketing, publicity, editor, and that whole, my editor left her job before the book went into production. She said, I'm sorry, I'm done and I'm leaving. Fortunately, we had gotten to a final draft. And then my entire marketing and publicity team also left.
What? I'm sorry. Is this? I'm sorry. I've gotten a little confused. Is this Anticipation?
Yes, it was very lively. So then 3 weeks before the book,
I had never published, heard.
I had a new publicity team, and none of them had read the book. So my agent said, if someone doesn't read this book on this team, if everyone doesn't read this book, we're pulling it back, and you're going to not publish it, because you cannot publicize a book you haven't read. I'm sorry. And so, the editor-in-chief got involved, and everybody, suddenly got up to speed because it switched so much. And then it came out during the Omicron wave. So that was a very exciting experience that I don't recommend. But it was a lesson in, how different things can be. Let's just put it that way.
My goodness.
Very different from my first book. That was really, babied the whole time. So.
Yeah, well, for those of you out there who have not yet published your first book, and I can assure you that it doesn't always happen that way. I hear the sound of people closing their computers and walking away from them.
No, I mean, it worked. I mean, it was definitely not what I had hoped for, but it happened. It's a real book. It continues to sell.
It continues to sell. Yeah, I think you have
never a week that it doesn't sell. So, despite all that, it's managed to sort of stumble through. I mean, it was a little bit, publishing during the Omicron wave, though, I had all these in-person events scheduled. Everybody was very excited and liberated. And then all of a sudden, everything shut down very rapidly. And it was kind of like, spending a year and a half or 2 years, whatever, building this beautiful little intricate wind up toy and then winding it up and having it just go over the edge of a cliff and disappearing and like making little sounds. I was like, okay, so I guess I'll write another book. It's a little bit, anticlimactic. What was nice about it is that I had all these events with people who were all over the country, instead, of being local. And then in some ways, it kind of prolonged the book's activity because as people woke up and wanted to see each other in person again, I began doing in-person events, and I'm still doing them recently for that book, which is pretty unusual because it came out in 2021. So anyway,
That's fantastic.
it's an interesting story. It's not at all what happened with my first book.
And please, with those of you, as I said, who are, haven't yet published your first book, this doesn't always happen.
No, I hope not.
It sounds like an opera. So the second part of my question, I don't even know I can't really seriously, coherently ask this question now, which is, how many editors do you have?
Okay, but that's not a bad question, actually, because
you can't count that high.
right. So in some ways, I had more editorial input for my first book, actually, because I had only one editor with my second book. No one else saw. There were no beta readers. I had a signed contract. I had to produce that book on deadline. I didn't have any time to go over it with anybody else. I asked her whether she wanted a first draft, and she said, sure, we'll start with that. I gave her 780 pages. I had one editor, and we went into the end. That was a very different experience from my first book, in which I hired Judy when I was a debut author with a manuscript. She did 3 rounds with me. She helped me find an agent. And then I actually edited it again because there were many in-house, very strange experience. A lot of in-house editors at big publishing houses wanted to acquire it, but their committees wouldn't agree. I feel like
a lot of us have been through that.
So each time, but unusually, a major editor, actually Susanne Porter at Random House, said, we will edit your book for you, and hopefully we will get it into a state where they will accept it. So she actually edited my book for 3 months with me and her assistant, which was an extraordinary experience because that was my second editor, high-powered editor, working on this book with me. And then after that, I did another round with my agent's editor.
Goodness, I totally.
Yeah, and then it was acquired in 4 days in a preempt, so by Simon & Schuster. So the whole thing was like, is this a success or not a success? It was a very interesting experience. I mean,
I'm sorry to say that all the drama I've had is not equal to the drama you had with that one book. Susanne, can you tell us something about what your book is about? And I lost track of how many editors she worked with. I can't count that way. But Susanne, can you tell us something about your book and how many different editors you had work on it, of different sorts of editors?
Okay, so my story is a little bit different. I was I was traditionally published for my first 6 books, first with Touchstone of Simon & Schuster, and then with Bloomsbury USA Children's for 4 YA historical novels. And then after that, whatever reason, I didn't end up getting any. My editor left, and the story, it happens. There's a lot of turnover. When I was working in traditional publishing, I had one editor, and I didn't really, I was just flying, but I didn't know what I didn't know, is, you know how it is. And since then, I've done self and hybrid publishing. I've worked with independent editors and coaches, and I am a book coach and editor myself. And what is fascinating to me is the process that people have to go through. First of all, I'd love to ask a question, if anybody wants to put in the chat. How many of you have used an editor on whatever you're working on right now? Just say, yes, no, whatever. I'm just curious. A lot of you don't have your things on, or I just say raise your hand. But okay, so here's the thing.
The counts are coming in.
Yay. I see him.
107, 108, 109.
Yeah. The thing is that what what Melodie talked about was with her first book, she hired an outside editor to help her get it into shape to pitch, right? Is that about the
An
right?
agent, precisely.
Yeah. And the thing is that I think that there's a misconception sometimes amongst authors who have not yet published that if they get editorial input, it's somehow going to change their work, that it's somehow going to, not be theirs anymore. And nothing could be further from the truth, really. I think that getting the input of an editor is absolutely essential. And it's rare that somebody, especially a debut author, once you've got a book accepted, like Melodie did, then it's different. They know you, they know what to expect. I sold 2 books on 1-page proposals, but they you have to put your best foot forward if you're going out there to pitch the first time. And it's very difficult as an author to see everything that needs to have that's going on in your book. You're blind to it in a way, and it's your baby. And you need people to be honest with you, but not unkind. And the problem is that if you just rely on beta readers, say, those readers, unless they have some knowledge, they're not necessarily going to know. Maybe they do if you've got really good ones, but they're not necessarily going to be able to steer you in the right direction to really sort of tell you what where your work is not falling down, but where it could use a little bit more help, so to speak. I'm rambling, but the point is, yes, and I see here a lot of people here, Giulietta, yes, an editor makes it better. A good editor makes it better.
And what you said at the beginning, Susanne, really spoke to me. An editor makes it more yours.
Yes.
It becomes the essence of what you, at your absolute best, can say.
Yes.
A good editor will consolidate it and it looks just like your book. And you can't even, sometimes you can't even remember what changed about it. Or, I mean, you can, but it's the same book, except it's so much better at doing what you were trying to do.
Exactly, because the editor has that mile-high view that you can't have because you've been stuck in the weeds. You've sweated those words onto the page. You're really, really attached to them. And when I'll tell you, here's when you've done your best. First of all, you should never send unless they ask for it. And they're, as you said, Melodie, but your editor at the publisher said it's okay to send me a first draft. Generally, your first draft is for you alone. You need to make your book, you need to self-edit get it to the best place you can get it as a writer.
I will say it wasn't first, but I said, do you want it relatively unedited, or should I edit it outside before giving it to you, was sort of what I meant. But it definitely, she wanted an early version to be able to shape it. And that was the conversation.
So so absolutely, that proves my point.
There's
a question in the chat. I wonder whether we could address now.
Yeah, I can see that, but I wonder if
it's pertinent to what we're talking about, and you want to
hire an editor before they can even. All right, so there's a lot of ways to get editing. And of course, the best way really is if you can afford to hire a really good professional editor, but not everybody can. I didn't. And we do this, if you have very good writer friends who are really good, who really get you, we do a lot of trading amongst ourselves. I've read many things that Stephanie was working on, and she, for me as well, for instance. So it's a sort of, we do this quid pro quo thing, but and there's also a lot of ways to self-edit that are really, really worth digging into. And there's 2 really different kinds of editors to hire. A developmental editor is going to look at the big picture, read the whole manuscript, and give you a letter, a top line thing reacting to whatever it is in the story, what works, what doesn't work, what might help, et cetera, et cetera. A line editor will dig in and make comments all the way throughout, and a big picture thing. Line editing is
Isn't that a bit like a copy editor? A line
no,
editor?
no. Copy
No.
editing is something else. Line editing is sort of combines because they're not looking for mistakes in the things. They're looking at style. They're looking at inconsistencies and all this kind of thing. So the developmental editor is the Mile High View. The line editor is the Mile High View plus a line by line thing, and that's like the most expensive kind of editing you can get. Usually the developmental editor is not, it's more of a top level thing, which is really worthwhile. And copy editing, it's good to send a clean manuscript if you can when you're pitching. That doesn't, and I'm thinking even just a proofreader is a good idea, because I think that's not horrifically expensive to do. And I think it shows that you've put a lot of effort into it, but a copy editor is good because it goes that
Once
one
you're
step
in a big
further.
publishing house, you have a copy.
You get
editor.
all that. Yeah.
So all of those things come with the package. I did co-publish an anthology with a lot of people who were part of this group. And we self-published. So that was my other experience of publishing.
Yeah.
It was a compilation of 9 historical fiction short stories all about plague. Interestingly enough, Lisa Yardy put it together, but interestingly enough, unplanned prior to COVID, it came out on March 16th of 2020. Really
Love that.
eerily
The
timed.
serendipity.
I think it didn't do very well in part because people just couldn't deal. But
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it was actually a really interesting experience to have this very other non-traditional self-publishing group effort.
Mhm.
There are other models, just to be aware that even though I think the message here is that editors are extraordinary and will transform your
Yeah.
work and possibly make it happen. There are other
Right.
ways. I know a lot of authors who have beta reader friends, or writing groups that are, they feel confident about. But also, some people self-publish and then become recognized, end up in traditional publishing through their self-publication.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different roads to getting your
Yeah,
work.
but
I'm
we
not
could-
quite, I have done all of those things too. I self-published a couple of things and I hybrid published, which is another route to publication. I have one book that came out with She Writes Press, and I think Susan, your book was Spark Press, right? The Susan Wands.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, it's the same basic thing, and they're very reputable and everything. They do not do any developmental editing. They only do the copy editing and that sort of thing. So if you want the story level stuff before you really need to get that outside of there. Oh yes, lovely, beautiful.
Thank
Susan.
you. Thank you.
So yeah. So yes. Oh God. So the thing is that there are lots of different ways to get editors and lots of different kinds of editors to get. And I know somebody asked the question about how much it costs. Where you need to go, there's guidelines, relative guidelines to what you can expect to pay if you're hiring an outside editor. And and I should have thought of this, looking this up beforehand, because I used to belong to it. It's an association of editors, and they have guidelines for costs. And I think, for instance, I recently looked up a developmental edit. It depends on the length of the book. It's around $2,000 to $2,500, I think, was their average. But, if you're hiring a really high profile editor, somebody who's got a big name and has edited tons of wonderful books, you're going to pay more, obviously. But sometimes it's by the word, like copy editing is usually around 3 cents a word, for instance. Yeah. Oh, and then Alan talks about how often you disagree with an editor if suggested changes are contrary to the research you have done. I have never had an editor suggest a change that called my research into question. I had one time I had to change something when I was writing with my book In the Shadow of the Lamp, which was about a parlor maid stealing away sort of with Florence Nightingale to go to the Crimea. And I had referred to, it was all first person, and I had referred to Muslims as Mohammedans because that's what they would have done at the time. That was the correct, that was how the Victorians referred to them. And my editor at Bloomsbury at the time said, and it was in 2010 or something like that, 9/11, everything, all that stuff was still fresh in our minds. She said, you really have to change this to Muslim, not Mohammedan.
Mm.
And it wasn't a hill that I was willing to die on. So I said, okay. And, and I don't think any of my readers would have necessarily taken me to task for it. But that is literally the only time I've had somebody ask me to change something historical. Usually editors aren't looking for that.
The
Editors are
only
looking
thing
for
that
the
is very
story.
rare. That's not what they do. Although I had one
Yeah.
copy editor who was really astute say, note that there was a semicolon in a historical letter. And they knew, and they
That's
said
cool.
the semicolon wasn't invented then. I said, oh my
The
God.
copy
thank you."
editor
Yeah.
friend who's
That
like
was
that.
so good. I thought that's
Yeah,
amazing.
a good
Can I just
yeah.
step in here to say, because I want to know for myself. So far, I know there are 4 types of editors. Your developmental editor, which is overall view, your line editor, which is every little line, for consistency and stuff. Then you have your acquiring editor, who often also develops the book.
Right.
I mean, my editors have done some really, in certain places, some wonderful things. And then you have your copy editor.
Mhm.
Is there lurking out there any kind of editor I don't know about that I have not mentioned at this time?
I don't think so. What about Melodie? Can you think of anything?
That feels quite thorough. I mean,
Yeah.
there are people. It's interesting to call them different things. I mean, I think they're really 2 fundamental types of editing, but maybe rather than have a different name for the editor, it would be kind of what the editor's doing can be distinguished. Like and editors might do multiple things. Some editors, for example, there's some issues that you might be focusing on language. You might be focusing on plot. Could be, so all of these things are might be at different stages. And you might, for example, like a line edit is very different from having a development, a letter,
Yeah.
or a letter, which could be 20 pages long that goes through the whole manuscript, not just line by line, but actually giving you comments.
It's the high level view.
Well,
Yes, that's
structure.
a
So
developmental
these are
edit.
different, these are not so
Yeah.
different kinds of editors, but different kinds of editorial feedback.
Editing, yes, different kinds of editing, yes. I mean, I do both line editing and developmental editing for people, so it depends on what it is they want. I
But
do
I mean,
not copy edit. I do not proofread.
It's a different,
one of the
it's a
questions,
different way of looking at things. I have a
yeah,
friend who
that's it, for
is a
sure.
marvelous copy editor, and she, as will say very plainly, that she just does not have an original mind to create things or see problems. She just sees, the commas and the fact that I called one character by 4 different names in my latest book. Yes, indeed, I did. It was a minor character. I'm listening to you, and I must, the historian in me is going back to think that how Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre, sent it in perfectly. There was no editing, there was no copy editing, there was none of this stuff. And 5 weeks later, after she sent it in, it was published and in bookstores.
Yeah.
And when you think of the way things have changed from 1846, I think, or 1847 to now, it's positively mind-boggling what a team it takes now, and all these different people pulling back and forth. I myself have used mostly beta readers, friends, because I've got friends like Susanne, of course, who is a professional, and that has been just fine for me. I've never used a developmental editor. In fact, the first time someone said my book is in development, I tried to look intelligent, but I had no idea.
Judy has made a really great comment here about
Mhm.
what kinds of editing there are at different levels and also at different prices, different levels of intensity. So there's a lot of concern about, how much you can invest and how much time it takes. But she has delineated those in the chat. I don't know if everyone can see that, but I recommend.
I think I don't know. Generally, we do the chat at the end. It's kind of even.
But there's a lot going on in there, and she has commented that
I can see them flying by.
Yeah.
And
And I think there's also a certain amount of anxiety about, gee, if I can't afford an editor, am I toast? And that's certainly not true. I did not have an editor. I had an agent who read my stuff, but he didn't, he gave the high level things. He didn't sort of dig in when I was traditionally publishing. And you know, what you have to do is really develop your self-editing chops. And there's some excellent resources for that out there. In fact, I have this book here. My current favorite kind of person, Tiffany Yates Martin, intuitive editing. It's really good, and there are plenty of resources like that out available for writers. And you know, there are of course the AI things like Pro Writing Aid and stuff. Those never seem to work for me. They always sort of correct the wrong things or point out the wrong things. But that's not developmental type. That's really
Something
little
that you
things.
said at the beginning, Suzanne, regarding editing your own work, which is not impossible if you really can't manage having anyone else do it for various reasons, is that because you are so immersed in it as you're writing it, it is a good idea to take a break from it before you try to edit it.
Very good point. Very
So
good point.
Yes, absolutely, totally
And
agree.
editing and revising are two different things. That's the other thing. And editing, once you've got a first draft, you don't go back to the beginning and start looking at the words, because you're just going to get sucked in and doing all this. You have to step back from it and really try to look at it from a higher perspective than the words. I mean, it's crazy to say that, but you kind of have to get off the page in order to address a big level revision.
There's a bigger, I'm noticing it, I've read a bunch of new novels recently, or new to me. There's a momentum in a book that even the words may be beautiful, the characters may be beautiful. There's something that is like the track that the book is running on, that you have to make sure that where your track is going. It's I don't know if I'm explaining that very well, but I feel, golly, I've been writing novels for a long time, and many, of course, have not seen the light of day. Maybe they will, but I still, like, I'm still learning. I feel like, why didn't I know this 2 years ago? It's easy, and that's kind of scary.
Yeah,
I think that.
absolutely.
One of the questions I had asked you both kindly to send me some questions. And so this one is Suzanne's leaping out at me. What's a book coach compared to an editor? That was your question.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, because an editor, yes, I asked you to ask that, because an editor, you hire an editor when you've got a complete manuscript, or if you want feedback on a chunk of it or something like that. A book coach is somebody who kind of gets in the trenches with you and gives you the for some reason I don't have words tonight. I'm really sorry. I'm a writer and I have no words, but it gets down in the trenches and helps you get that book on the page, I guess is what I would say, and gives you the accountability. Helps sometimes. People work differently. Some people like this, some people don't. It's it's a lot of brainstorming. For instance, I'm working on a multi-timeline manuscript myself right now, and I am working with a coach whom I know, who's fabulous, and she's working on a dual timeline novel too, and we are coaching each other. And what that consists of is giving each other deadlines where we have to get X amount of stuff done, or we have to send each other pages, and then we discuss them, and we do a lot of brainstorming and a lot of, looking at each other's ideas and saying, this is very new, so we're not looking at the words and kind of critiquing the words. We're saying, well, the stakes aren't high enough, or where's the pace going to come from, or can't there should be a complication in there because it's falling flat, that kind of thing. And we're both probably a year away from a first draft. So, and that's, so coaching us, somebody mentioned in the chat being a consultant, and I don't know, maybe that's the same sort of thing, but a book coach is kind of your cheerleader and tough love dealer, that sort of thing, and editor, and editor as well. But it is a different sort of relationship than from an editor. Yeah.
This is one of Melodie's questions, which interests me very much. So I might ask her this question that she sent to me, which are, what are some of the hardest changes you have had to make?
Yes. So, it's interesting. I've talked about this before, but it's always changes. One of the hardest things I had to do at all, was create an entire new section for a time period that I hadn't researched. In anticipation, it covers a lot of ground, but in a sort of a punctuated way, because of the history of this place covers a lot of time, but I wasn't going to spend the whole time talking about the entire period uninterruptedly. There's a very important, it starts in the 13th century, and it kind of goes back and forth between the past and the present, with the past accelerating forward. But as I was getting to the end of this extraordinarily long manuscript and getting close to deadline, there's a very important period that I kind of glossed over, which is the War of Independence, which is, right around the time of the Enlightenment. It's the beginning of nationhood. It has a lot of excitement in it, but, I was writing mostly medieval, or what would be considered Byzantine from a Greek perspective. And nothing, in my book before that was medieval. And all of a sudden, my editor read it and she said, I need you to bring this entire time period to life in its own section. That was my second. This is the first pass with this editor. So at that, plus I cut, while cutting 400 pages from the manuscript, I added an entire section during the War of Independence in Greece.
That's very inspiring to see how, even for me, and I've done many novels for everybody, to see how drastically a book can change and make leaps and huge cuts, and something that you would have said, oh God, no, I'll rather die than cut that.
Yeah,
and all of a sudden you say cut, and you've got a book that just feels, I don't know it.
It feels totally like itself. And this is what's so amazing. My first draft of both of my novels were close to 800 pages. That's how I do it.
Really?
I knew that's what happened. Both times, both of them came out at around 450. I think of it as, I saw the Mark Rothko exhibit many years ago at MoMA, and at the old MoMA. And I remember being really struck by how these paintings, which are so incredibly enormous, give this feeling of incredible intensity and detail. And I later read that the way he paints them is under a light that is so incredibly bright that is not what anyone would see it under, so that this very large amount of detail is visible to him, and you can't quite see it, but it's all there, and that gives it this depth and power.
Oh,
he's doing it under a brighter light than his viewers. So that's a little bit, to me, what editing a manuscript down feels like. It just becomes this hyper concentrated version of itself, and all the stuff you cut is still there. It's just not visible.
It's not visible. And then going back to what you were saying, how before is that editors come in and you can, and people are sometimes scared of editors. If I get an editor, a new writer will say, it won't be my book anymore, it'll be their book, but it might be the most, if it's an editor who's in sympathy with what you do. If you've written a horror story, do not go to an editor who cannot abide horror stories. That was not a good idea. But if you get someone in sympathy, you can make something stronger and better than you ever. I had that experience with one of my books, Claude and Camille, with my editor, who really showed me how to bring up.
I love that.
That's a great book. Yes.
And really, I just couldn't quite see it. And she would say one thing, I don't know what she'd even say to me. There's be no suggestion of how I should do something or anything. She'd just say something, and all of a sudden the book would go boom.
Yeah, and you know it usually.
You know
Yeah.
it. You feel that
there are a couple
boom,
of things that give you the hint that it's coming, like something really good. One of them is, oh yeah, that's it. And the other is overwhelming nausea and terror.
Yeah.
And those are actually usually a tip that you're onto something.
Yeah. Can I also though say that editing doesn't always involve cutting down? In fact,
I added 90 pages when she asked me.
Well, no, what I mean is that editors often will look and see what's not on the page, and not in a big section, but for instance, a classic thing that I see when I'm looking at my clients' work is that you know, it's very clear in their head, but the emotion just isn't on the page.
It's not on the page. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in their mind and they think it's there, but it's not. And
It's
that's
not.
That's a common
yeah.
editorial comment. It really
Very
is.
common, yes, yeah. And so then you're looking at you're sort of you're adding depth, I would say, is what editors can look for. That what they do is they dig in and they help you push it further.
Or they might, for example, see that the arc of a given character have a purpose, like
Mhm.
why would this person, when you think you have this idea because you want them to go to some place, well, why would this person leave their job and move to this other country? That there's no motivation. I don't see that. Or,
Mhm.
and I have been told on one occasion that two characters were playing the same role in my book and I should get rid of one of them and just collapse them into one.
Yes, yes.
Like they're redundant. And that was funny. I said, well, how did that happen? Why would I do that? But I mean, you don't see these things. It's very
You
hard
don't
to
see it.
see things,
You don't. I think we do gain a little wisdom as we go on and keep
Yeah,
writing these things.
you try.
Yeah, I hope my drafts are better than they used to be.
Oh my God. Yeah. I really, I mean, I would just stumble on for ages over things that were really relatively simple. But as I did that and I went on, it did gain each book gained a lot of depth. So that was important. Susan Wands, I'm wondering if we should, I've been seeing an awful lot of chat come in. I haven't read it.
Yes, I've been keeping track of the questions. We've got three really good questions we could address.
Is it about
right now.
time to open it up to the
Yes,
chat?
it's
Yeah, I
6:45.
was beginning to think
Perfect.
so. And unless either one of you has something burning that you want to say so far.
Questions are good.
When you hear the
Yeah,
questions
yeah.
in the
Okay.
chat, you're gonna have a lot of things. So
Let's bring up the first question that was brought up right away by Alan. He asked, when do you suggest a specific editor be involved in writing about a specific culture, for example, Native American, Japanese, etc.?
That's a very interesting
That's
thing.
another kind of editor, actually.
Yeah, I think that there's two different roles there. One is the edit, even if an editor has no familiarity with the culture, they can still look at it as a story, because that's what the editor's doing is, does this story work? Are the characters believable? That sort of thing. But the cultural sensitivity is kind of a separate thing, at least as, there are sensitivity readers and that kind of thing. And
I'm on that.
if you can find a good editor who also is, then that would be great. But I don't think it's a prerequisite for having an editor. I don't think they have to know. In fact, I love editing things I know nothing about, because first of all, I have this clearer view of it, but also I'm learning.
Yeah.
So,
and I think you can
yeah.
also, I mean, having a sensitivity reader for addressing cultures that you're really ignorant about and might make bad missteps in is a good idea, which is a different set of questions. In the way that I think writers can write about a lot of things that we don't know and that we have not experienced. Editors can edit a lot of things that they don't know or don't experience. And one of the things the editor is doing is trying to get a feeling for whether you can bring this to life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's all about the
The
story.
question of whether you're wrong is an issue. About what that culture contains and how it operates, and that for that you need someone who with individual experience, but that's different often from an editor.
Yeah, really good point.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. I'd love to go on to the second question. There was a little back and forth on the chat field about this, but I'd love your take on this with you, Stephanie. I believe the person's name is pronounced Guylaine. They asked, so if a new writer needs to pay for an editor before they can even try to get an agent, then is publishing really only for the wealthy? Should working class writers not even bother? I think the cost of hiring editors is what they're addressing.
Wow. Well, my goodness. Well, I can just say that when I first started to write, I had no money, so I simply did. But I think that was 30 years ago when I did my first book, so that the world wasn't quite the same. Unfortunately, I think, I mean, is it possible to do it without a lot of money, or a fair amount of money? Yeah, I think it's easier if you do have money to spend on various aspects. What do you both think, my panelists here?
You
I
know,
think it's harder now than it
Okay.
used to be, way harder, you know? And I think that you're up against a lot more competition if you want to be traditionally published. And so it helps to get that outside input before you actually are submitting. But as I said, you know, you can train yourself to be a really good self-editor and really, you know, make yourself do it. And there are plenty of books that get published and that have not had professional editors that people paid for
Mhm.
do them. But there's also, you know, I know I'm working with a couple of majorly published authors who are paying me to help them before they send it to their editor, because they want that that sort of that look at it
Mhm.
to make it as good as it can be until before it gets
I mean,
to
I
that
feel that
point.
way now, even though my next book, you know, I have a contract for first refusal for my next book.
Mhm.
And I would likely have an in-house editor and they know me and my books are selling and I have two of them and it's, you know, but I have in my own mind, I would like to hire an outside editor because I want time
Mhm.
to work on it beforehand. So
Mhm.
that it's the best it can be before I get into that publication schedule, which moves very at its own pace and it may not be my pace.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to be forced into something fast. I think though, there are lots of different levels at which you can pay. You know, Judy Sternlight really outlined them. She
Mhm.
actually did something for me that was super helpful, that was not very expensive at all, right at the beginning. And it could have been enough, I would say, and affordable for many people. I decided to keep going. I mean, I have another job, right? So it's a little different. I mean, surviving as a writer is impossible for most people anyway,
Mhm.
Stephanie, but I can't. But you know, I think that, you know, what she did for me is she said, I was really struggling thinking about, I wasn't planning to pay for this. Like, this is not an expense that I had on my mind. I had 3 kids, you know, yes, I'm working full time, but still. Um, and I had a conversation with my 11th grade English teacher who I'd met in a park, who got, you know, who, when I was had finished this novel, and he said, think of this as an MFA in which
Mhm.
the subject of your study is your own work, and then reevaluate what it's worth to you. You know, there are a lot of different, I didn't have an MFA. Some people say, oh, you have to have this, and I didn't have that. I'd never studied writing other than just writing or in college. And, you know, writing is not what I have studied. I've studied a lot of things. You know, I'm a scientist and I'm a physician, but I didn't study fiction. So there are many different paths to getting to this place. What Judy did for me when I was on the fence about whether to hire her was she said, okay, write me an outline. I will critique your outline. That's all. And then we'll talk and see what you want to do. Her critique of my outline was so outrageously fantastic and so sickeningly right that I was like, this is horrible. I have to go lie down because she was so on track and I realized how much work I had to do. That made me want to hire her. But you could have stopped there if you really couldn't go on. And that was not an expensive proposition at all. And say, okay, I'm just going to go with this for now, knowing the work that I have ahead of me. And hopefully I can do it. So there are a lot of different ways to get there. Um, and you know, this question, there's another question in the chat that I think is really important, is like, that we answered only partially, where people said, you know, have you ever had a comments from an editor that was incorrect, or you thought you didn't want to pursue? And historical fact is only one of them, and it's very rare. I think much more compelling is if an editor makes a suggestion and it doesn't feel right to you, what do you do? And how do you know whether it's right or not? I think that's a little elusive, but there are moments when I say, no, I cannot do that.
Mhm.
That is not okay. Like
No.
you have agency over your work. It is your
You
heart. You
can
know what
say
it is.
no. You can say no.
Yeah,
Remember,
you can
Yes.
say, I'm not doing that. I will
yeah,
do this. This makes sense to me, or this one doesn't make sense to
yes, I have
me.
done
I
that. The
can't.
first time I did that, I expected the walls to fall in, you know, and my whole thing. And the editor said, okay. It was like, I still remember the line. And I'm a person who tries to say yes. That's just
Mhm.
who I am. And I said, nope.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's a gut deep thing that you have to, you know
Yeah,
what you're trying to do, and
it
it
was a,
it boils down to your whole reason for writing the book in the
yeah.
end, you know.
I
So,
think I think we should go back to the chat room, but something that Melody said is a question of what is the value of something to you? I mean, if you're just managing to pay your rent, you have no extras or anything. Of course, it's not possible to think of hiring an editor unless you want to take a loan. But I feel, and I've discussed this with some friends, if you do have some money, most people do something nice, get a new couch, or I don't know what, go to on a trip or something. Use the money, and the thing that might be the most important to you is use the money for your book, because a book is the thing that wells up from deep inside you very often for many, many years, and maybe that's more important than something else that you might do. It's expensive, but
And I mean, you can often self-publish without editing, without a professional editor. So
well,
you don't,
you could. That's another subject.
I mean, all I'm saying is that it's not like you can't be a writer, because this isn't the only way to be a writer either,
No,
right?
I've never paid for editorial help. So, and I've published 6 books so far. So, but can we get back to the chat room? I'm afraid is a burning question that I don't know of.
What else is happening there?
Well, the last question we had was very much what you were talking about, editors. Alan asked, how often do you disagree with an editor, especially if suggested changes are contrary to the research that you have done?
I think we sort of covered that in the before, but it's worth revisiting, because that was my thing about that. There was only once that my editor actually made me change something related to my research. And again, I think the editor isn't looking for whether your historical stuff is correct or how, they're looking for what's going to make this story go, what's going to give, make your characters, make people fall in love with your protagonist and make them go along on that journey with them, and have, keep turning the pages from beginning to end. And that's what the editor is trying to do, is to strengthen the story, to deepen the story, to do all of that. They're not like the history police. They're not going to say, oh, can't you make this person different because, I couldn't this be a woman instead of a man? Or, I don't know. That's a gross sort of
Martha
over
in the chat on
thing.
this point makes a good point, though, that if you don't agree with an editor, they might be still onto something. And I think
Yes.
that's a great point, because sometimes they know something's wrong, and you might even know something's wrong, or maybe they alert you to the fact that something's wrong, and then you have to figure out what is wrong. And it isn't necessarily what they said, but maybe something else has to change. So, I had this experience where a writer who was trying to publish his first novel asked me for advice. He met me at a conference and he said, do you think I could talk to you about my work in progress? I said, I don't have a ton of extra time, but we had met there, and he's an academic in other ways. So we ended up talking, and he said he had given his manuscript to a beta reader colleague, and that colleague was like, he said, I think it was he has a short attention span. He couldn't really get through it. And I said, okay, so I have my bell, alarm bells are ringing, because if you're accusing your beta reader of having a short attention span, maybe there's something wrong with your book. You have to think about that, right? It's possible that maybe you are dragging on. And then he said, well, one of the reasons he approached me is that he thought that my story was complex, and maybe it's okay to be super complex. And I said, well, now I'm getting even more alarm bells. I said, well, what do you mean exactly? And then he had a lot of ambition for this book, doing a lot of different things. And one of them, he said, and it's also probably okay if you interrupt the story for a little while to just give some historical facts, right? And then he starts talking about the historical facts and saying that he spent 3 paragraphs.
No.
I said, no,
No.
I have not read your book, but now I am fairly sure that you have made some mistakes, which is what is putting your beta reader to sleep, which is that you stepped out of the story and you spent 3 paragraphs talking about the Dutch India Company. So this is no. And no, making it more complex, I do not recommend that. And trying to sell.
Those are, as Helen says, that those are things you put in the author's note, in the historical note, if you want to tell people about that stuff.
For sure.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
You don't do that. So anyway,
Yeah.
I think there are some things, though, if a reader is reacting, whoever that reader is, even if they're not a best editor in the whole world, or you pay them $20,000 or whatever it is you did or didn't do, or even $100 just to read your outline or whatever it is. So you can still, if people are reacting a certain way, you can always say, what might I have done that could cause that? It's not necessarily your fault, but then think, is there something I should change as a result of this comment that I'm getting, or is it just annoying?
Yeah.
Authors, this has been really great.
Is,
I was just going to do one more plea. If people have questions, to put them in the chat. Otherwise, I think we're closing it up on 7 o'clock. Did you have some closing remarks you'd like to make, Stephanie?
Oops. Oh, sorry.
I'm trying to think of something wise to say. It's uh, for me. I mean, I love writing. I'm very happy when people read my work. And one person said something I disagree with. I listen, but I don't do anything. If two people say it, I might move. If three people say it, I move. That is one thing I've learned. It's a complicated business. We've come a long way from Charlotte Bronte submitting something and getting it in the bookstores five weeks later. But I'm glad you're all here, and it's definitely, it's, you know, I haven't read Melodie's a second novel, which is on my shelf, and I'm going to do that now, not for lack of interest, but for lack of time.
It's my first there. That's the picture that you just sent. I think, Susan, when you posted the picture, that's my first novel, Scribe of Siena, which I had a really
Oh,
great.
that I have read. Yes, I've read.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one. I'm just saying that Susan posted the novel I've been talking
No,
about.
no, Anticipation. No, I have that on my shelf. And it was
Anticipation
exactly
is the second.
yeah, no, that'd be a good thing. So I think it's yeah, we know, you all know how complicated. You've probably heard the most complicated it can possibly ever get. Tonight we heard a story about that, but getting, you know, reading a book that you love is wonderful, and getting your story out there and having people read it is wonderful. So we just get through all the rest, and that's all I have to say. Does either one of you have anything to say, Melodie?
Just thank you so much for making this happen. It's a
Thank
great
you for
pleasure. It's a
coming.
great topic. I think it's very hard to imagine how miraculous an editor can be unless you're in the position of working with one. And it is a truly exhilarating relationship that if you can have the privilege to be in, I highly recommend.
Yeah.
And
She said it
Susanne?
all. What can I say?
No,
No, this was a great pleasure. I could talk about writing and editing for till the cows come home, so it's good that this is time limited.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to interact with you in this setting. Thank
Yes,
You
really,
know, I was really
nice.
afraid when we came in tonight. I said, what am I going to do if I ask a question, they answered, and there's dead silence.
Oh, that never happened. I'm sorry. You had two very talkative authors here. It's
This did
fine.
not come to pass. I said, what will I do? I've got to write more questions. What do I do?
No worries.
That's worrying about something that.
Yeah, well, thank you to
Thank
Susan
you so much.
and Stephanie.
And read
Yeah,
her work too,
And
Stephanie.
do people know your books? So did we?
they're in the Susan's been great about posting stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you very much, Susan, for Susan Wands for helping me through this, and good night, everybody.
That concludes our program. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. You can find out more about the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society and our leadership at our website, or contact us at hns-nyc@mail.com. And finally, please consider supporting our volunteer panelists and hosts. You can contact them at their websites in the description. Thanks for joining us.